always remember where you were. So will they.
It was a very brief conversation. We told each other we loved each other.
Tonight, First Lady Laura Bush and the men and women of the White House relive the day America changed forever.
The military operator came on the line with a rather shaken voice and said, "Miss Hughes, we are unable to contact Air Force One."
That morning, they too were targets.
I said, "Sir, you can't come back here. Washington's under attack."
But with a job to do.
If the plane would not divert, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
Tonight, 9/11 inside the White House.
We went to bed that night uncertain about what might happen before the dawn.
The president's team remembers. Here now is Stone Phillips.
Good evening. We count on them to be the best and brightest. But the men and women who live and work in the White House are often the first to tell you that in many ways, they are just like everyone else. That was certainly the case a year ago today. Though they stand at the pinnacle of power, what each of us was feeling that morning, they were feeling too. The shock and the horror. And at first, they had no better idea than anyone else what was happening or why. Tonight, First Lady Laura Bush and several top administration officials share their memories of that day in their own words. For the President and Mrs. Bush, the morning had started routinely. He had traveled to Florida to address children at an elementary school. She was headed to the Capitol for a meeting with Senator Edward Kennedy. Then, the first plane hit.
I got to Capitol Hill and Senator Kennedy met me at the door. And there was something for me very moving about being with him, because the only other day in my life that I remember that was so stunning to our whole country was the day his brother was assassinated.
The president was literally shaking hands in a receiving line, the principal, the superintendent, and so forth, and my cell phone rang, and it was my assistant, Susan Ralston, and this was about literally 8:49, 8:50. And she said that a plane had struck the World Trade Center, and it was unclear whether it was a military or commercial, whether it was a prop or a jet.
I've been director for 1 week, and as I recall it, I was in my office, and an individual came in and said there's a plane that's crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, and I look outside and it's a beautiful day, and you wonder how a pilot could be so off flight path to fly into the World Trade Center.
As I was walking out the door, about 8:45 or 8:50, I guess, my phone rang, and it was my assistant who said, "Karen, a plane has hit the World Trade Center." And they thought it was a small plane at the time, and that was the way she conveyed it to me. And so, of course, my immediate thought was, what a terrible accident, that, you know, the pilot must have gotten sick or had a heart attack, or it must have been a terrible accident.
As Matt just mentioned, we have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City. It happened just a few moments ago.
I was standing at my desk, and my executive assistant came in and said, "You know, a plane has hit the World Trade Center." And I thought, what a strange accident, and my mind immediately went to a small plane of some kind. And in fact, the first reports were that they were small, there was some sort of small plane or maybe a twin-engine plane of some kind. And I picked up the phone and I called the president, who was in Florida for an education event. And he had just heard, and I said, "Yes, Mr. President, a plane has hit the World Trade Center." And he also said, "What a strange accident."
Yes, Sam, get ready. May. Yes, May. Give yourselves a pat on the back.
At the other end of the office is a TV set, and as I walked in, obviously it's the World Trade Center. Black smoke billowing out of there, and I said, "What the heck is that?" Then about 5 minutes later, my chief of staff came back in and said, "It's been confirmed. It was a commercial airliner that went into the World Trade Center." And so as I then started getting closer to my TV set, and I was watching it, and all of a sudden from the right side of the set I see something gray, and then it sort of disappears, and then from the right side of the screen I see this white, billowy, yellow-orange cloud. And I go, "Holy cow."
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building.
I was in an airplane flying from Washington, D.C. to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. First, I asked if we could just turn this plane around and get back to Washington, D.C. They said we had inadequate fuel to get that done, so we landed in Milwaukee. And the circumstances in Milwaukee were just, it was clear that the country was in a different state than we were when we took off. There was security around the plane that was very tense. Obviously, I was simply biting my nails. How fast can we get the fuel into this airplane? Then there were questions about if we went back into the sky, whether we would be allowed to land in Washington.
Or wherever the president travels, there's a staff room, and so we went into the staff room next to this, I guess, first or second grade classroom in which he was. And there were telephones, secure telephones, so we began trying to get some information. We also scurried around and found a television set and plugged it into the outlet in the wall, and found a cable link and brought it in, and watched the footage, and then horrified watched the second plane fly in.
And it was clear that the second plane could not have been there as a coincidence. And turned out that the first plane was a jetliner. The second plane we knew to be a jetliner. And then I rushed to decide how to inform the president and when to inform him. And the test that I went through is, if I were president, would I want to know? And I felt very strongly that the president would want to know. So I gathered my thoughts, tried to be very efficient in the words that I used, took one step into the classroom, looked over to the press pool that was gathered at the back of the room. And I remember looking at one reporter, and she kind of looked at me like, "What are you doing here?" And I held up two fingers, said a second plane, and then waited for a slight break in the conversation in the classroom and went up to the president's right ear and said, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack."
Here now is Jane Pauley.
The most powerful people in Washington realized no sooner than we did that this was no accident, but they didn't have much time to adjust to the new reality. They had work to do. And while his staff worried about his safety, President Bush was preparing to speak to the world from a Florida elementary school.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. Today, we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Maybe we should have known after the first one, but there was still, after the first one was attacked, early on there was no, people still couldn't agree on what had actually happened.
At that point, there was a high degree of uncertainty because, of course, all these events had just happened. We didn't know if there were other events about to happen. Everybody was on high alert. So we were listening to news and getting inputs from around the world, trying to ascertain exactly what the situation was. But at that point, we had everyone on alert.
I got it. The issue here is the possibility of a concurrent hit elsewhere. I got it. NCSA check.
It is difficult to comprehend, but this country, the strongest country in the world, has been the target of a major coordinated terrorist attack, and the end is not over yet. Even if that's a beehive of activity down there, there is no more active area in terms of pedestrian traffic.
Here we go back to the collapse of that tower, but if you consider that this plane hit at mid-structure, and it would have probably taken out the electrical in the building where elevators explosion.
I can remember coming across the 14th Street Bridge here in Washington, D.C., and you get a really good shot of the Pentagon from that bridge, and looking over there and seeing on the far side from the way I was approaching it, this black smoke rising in this beautiful September sky. The scene driving up to the Pentagon, the building had, all the alarms went off, and so people were evacuating the building. It had been advised to do so. And so you're kind of fighting, you're like a fish swimming upstream as you weave your way into the building.
I was intent on getting the president to a safe environment where he had good communications, and by definition that was Air Force One at that particular moment. So we were anxious to get to Air Force One. As we were heading to Air Force One, we did hear about the Pentagon attack, and we also learned, it turned out to be a mistake, but we learned that the Air Force One package could in fact be a target. So we were anxious to get on the plane and get the plane safely in the sky.
I tried to get him on the phone, the president, and that was one of the most frightening moments of the day for me, because the operator, the military operator, came on the line with a rather shaken voice and said, "Ms. Hughes, we are unable to contact Air Force One." And apparently, we later learned they were taking some diversionary, they were flying at very high altitudes, and apparently it had affected the communication system for some moments there, but I didn't know that at the time, and it was a very disquieting moment, as you can imagine.
Well, the plane very quickly climbed to a high altitude and did fly a serpentine route. We also communicated with the Defense Department, and they scrambled some jets that were able to catch up with us and provide some protection. We did not let anyone know where we were going until literally just before we were getting ready to land. And we landed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where the president was able to get off the plane and allow some of the other people to get off the plane. And then he communicated to the world via video conference, because we did not have a satellite hookup.
When we got to Barksdale, we walked off the plane to be greeted by the commander of the 8th Air Force and his command officers in combat uniforms, every one of them with a sidearm. And there were no bands and no banners. There were airmen with automatic weapons, rounds in the chamber, looking out, not looking at the plane, but looking out to protect it. And the president rode from the plane to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force in an armed Humvee with a 50 caliber machine gun on top with a trooper manning it and rounds in the chamber. So, you know, if you hadn't gotten it before then, that was it. I mean, it was, you know, just the raw power being displayed there. And when you got the commander of the 8th Air Force wearing a sidearm, and you know that the country's on a different footing.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
While I was watching developments on television, and as we started to get organized to figure out what to do, my Secret Service agents came in, and they, under these circumstances, they just move. They don't say, "Sir," or ask politely. They came in and said, "Sir, we have to leave immediately," and grabbed me, and your feet touch the floor periodically, but they're bigger than I am, and they hoisted me up and moved me very rapidly down the hallway, down some stairs, through some doors, and down some more stairs into an underground facility under the White House. And it's in effect a corridor, locked at both ends. And they did that because they'd received a report that an airplane was headed for the White House.
Security forces have reported that they have received information of another plane hijacking, that it's about 20 to 25 miles out of Washington, D.C., headed in this general direction.
There were incoming reports that there had been a car bomb at the State Department, that there was a large fire on the mall near the Washington Monument, and just trying to sort through the information when a Secret Service agent came and said, "You have to go to the bunker. The Vice President is already there. There may be planes heading for the White House." And I stopped for one moment, and I called the President, and I said, "Mr. President, here's what's going on. The Pentagon has been hit. And he said, I'm getting ready to come back. He'd already made his way to the airport. And I said, sir, you can't come back here. Washington's under attack. And then I left for the bunker.
We drove into the White House on West Executive Drive. People were coming out of the White House, pouring out of the executive office building, running over towards Lafayette Park. And I said to my driver and security person, I said, hey, is there something wrong with this picture? Because here we are driving in and everybody else is running out. So I ran into the White House and someone said, you have to be briefed by Dick Clark of the National Security Council.
The room was oddly calm because everybody in there was a veteran in one way or another. And there wasn't a lot of chaos in the room. But there was a very clear sense of what had happened to us and the need to deal with the consequences.
Our first effort was probably in what you might call a stabilization. Let's kind of get things under control. If there are more situations where there might be other airplanes that are at risk, how do we minimize that risk? How do we get things taken care of? Obviously, as soon as you get hit, you want to make sure you don't get hit again, but you start thinking about who did this to me or who did this to us.
There were decisions that had to be made. The most difficult thing that was happening there was that Norm Mineta, the transportation secretary, the vice president, and I actually found ourselves trying to track tail numbers of civilian aircraft because they were trying to ground civil aviation. Probably the toughest decision that if an aircraft was not responding, an American jet fighter had an obligation to shoot it down.
I left the office and General Eberhardt called from North American Aerospace Defense Command out in Colorado Springs, and he said, you know, we've got several hijacked codes, meaning that the transponders in the aircraft are talking to the ground and they're saying we're being hijacked. Several hijack codes in the system, and we're responding with fighter aircraft.
The FAA is confirming that there are several, was the word I heard, several planes that are unaccounted for that were evidently hijacked and has not come to a conclusion yet.
There was an airplane showing to the ground that it was transmitting this hijack code coming in, looked like it was heading towards Washington. It was currently over Pennsylvania. And General Eberhardt said, we're sending fighters to intercept.
I suppose the toughest decision was this question of whether or not we would intercept incoming commercial aircraft. The President made the decision on my recommendation as well, wholeheartedly concurred in the decision he made, that if the plane would not divert, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
But before that could happen, of course, the passengers on that airplane took matters in their own hands, and as we know, the airplane crashed in Pennsylvania.
United 93, do you still hear Cleveland? United 93, United 903, do you hear Cleveland?
Never know for sure, but without question, the attack would have been much worse if it hadn't been for the courageous acts of those individuals on United 93.
Here again is Stone Phillips.
After the attacks, President Bush was flown from one secure military base to another, while key staffers were rushed to underground bunkers. When an attack on the White House no longer seemed an immediate threat, the president prepared to return. And the questions began. The first was, who did this? The answer came quickly.
It was not very long before I think anyone who knew the MO of Al-Qaeda had exactly the thought, this is Al-Qaeda. It smelled like Al-Qaeda. It felt like Al-Qaeda, the kind of grandiose character of it, the attention-getting character of it. I think we knew pretty early on, and of course a little bit later on in the day, George Tenet, the CIA director, confirmed that the CIA's assessment was that it was Al-Qaeda. But standing in the bunker only a few minutes after I had gotten there, I was pretty clear in my own mind that it was Al-Qaeda.
The idea of some sort of response immediately comes up, and The one thing we knew for certain, that a response, given the fact they attacked us on our soil and thousands of Americans, that this response had to be proportionate, and meaning a fairly big response.
The president wanted to come back, talked repeatedly during the course of the day. He made it clear he wanted back as soon as we thought it made sense. The Secret Service did not want him back. They even talked to me, tried to get me to evacuate a couple of times, but I didn't want to leave the node that we'd established there.
I sat at a computer in the shelter and typed my statement, and the computer worked, but the printer was almost out of ink. So history will show that the statement that I read from that day, it's barely legible because the printer was so short on ink in the cartridge.
I'm Karen Hughes, counselor to President Bush, and I'm here to update you all on the activities of the federal government in response to this morning's attacks on our country.
I felt so responsible for conveying what I was seeing, which was, I thought, very reassuring. I wanted to make sure that people knew that the federal government was functioning, that the national security team was meeting, that we were going to find out who did this, that we were responding as effectively as possible, that emergency crews were helping to try to find whoever we could find. And I wanted to help reassure the country.
The First Lady was on Capitol Hill getting ready to talk to a committee about education, and she was with Senator Kennedy when the attack happened, and she was taken from Capitol Hill to a secure location in Washington, D.C., and once she got to that secure location, there was communication from the Secret Service to Air Force One, and then the First Lady and the President spoke. They spoke several times when the plane was in the air as we headed toward Louisiana and then to Nebraska. The President did check on the safety of his two daughters, and he knew that they were well cared for. So I, unfortunately, did not call my wife. And my wife is a minister, and she was anxious to hear from me, but I did not talk with her until after we arrived back in Washington, D.C.
He called. It was a very brief conversation. We told each other we loved each other. He said he was fine. I said I was fine. And you know, that was it. Then he called in several other times during the day, and of course, after that, I called my girls and my mother.
We got into Andrews and got in the chopper, Marine One, and to come back into the White House. And there was still a plume of smoke out of the Pentagon. And the chopper was very quiet. And the President was on the left-hand side of the chopper, and he said, "Take a close look. You're looking at the face of war in the 21st century."
There was a way in which we went to bed that night uncertain about what might happen before the dawn. We didn't know whether there were other things that could transpire. Obviously, the entire country was on a high state of alert. And that's valuable, because the higher your state of alert, the more difficult it is for someone who might be choosing to do something to do something.
I stopped for one moment on the way to the bunker to call my aunt and uncle in Birmingham and to say, "I'm fine, tell everybody I'm all right." We're a very close-knit family, and I knew that there would be panic among the Rays and the Rices, and so I wanted them to know that I was all right. I didn't think about anything personal again for quite a long time. In fact, it was that Thursday night, this of course happened on a Tuesday, it was Thursday night when I got home about midnight, and I turned on the television for the first time. I'd not watched television during that entire period. We'd been too busy. Turned on the television, and the Brits were playing the American national anthem at Buckingham Palace, and I finally let go and broke down.
Karen Hughes, who resigned her high-powered position as White House counselor earlier this summer, says she doesn't know how much her decision to leave was influenced by September 11th. But like many people, after the attacks, she did want to spend more time with her family. If you have a story about 9/11 that you'd like to share with other viewers via our website, the address is dateline.msnbc.com. Coming up next, for the first time, the air traffic controllers in charge of the 4 hijacked planes reveal what they saw and heard that day. I'm Stone Phillips. NBC's coverage of 9/11 a year later continues.